Hey, thank you so much for joining us today. I am here with Cecilia Brown from Root Shocked and Casey Carter from Two Prisons and also Luz Carasa from Giants. And I'm so thrilled that you guys could join us and be a part of this discussion. And I just want to encourage you to ask questions of each other too, if you like. So maybe we could just begin by going around and introducing ourselves, and maybe you could tell us how you came to find this story and get involved in this story.
I'm Casey, and I am one of the co-directors of Two Prisons, which is about an activist from Beijing who moved to New York in late 2017 and was seeking political asylum here, following about a decade of persecution in China, resulting from his human rights activism, democracy activism. Unfortunately, my co-director, Colleen Kessingham, couldn't join us because she's in Romania at the moment with a pretty spotty internet connection. But yeah, so I came about this film. I met the protagonist of the film several years before he came to the States in China, very coincidentally when I was there for a summer, and he happened to be working for the very well-known dissident artist Ai Weiwei at the time. And I very briefly met him just by happenstance. And a friend of mine got to know him quite a bit better. And then when he moved to New York, put us in touch. And there was about a 6-month period of time as he was waiting for his asylum application to go through, where he legally couldn't work and couldn't do much else other than participate in this film, which I pitched to him about his life. So that's how that happened.
You know, could you tell us a little bit about the use of the artwork in your film? It's such a creative film that way, and it's so visually rich. And I'm just curious about how you made those choices and how it furthers the story also.
Yeah, you're referring to the excerpts from the asylum application as well as some of the other graphic elements?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so I should also mention our collaborator, Magdalena Orellana, who is in Spain right now, but she worked with us to create these graphic components. So from the beginning, I wanted to tell this story through kind of as the story of his life put forth in this application for political asylum, which is a very it requires a very detailed and honest, and it just requires a very complete telling of everything that this person has been through, in hopes that that story is enough to grant asylum. So the asylum application itself contains the majority of the story, except for in terms of a sequence of events. And then what we get from actually the series of reenactments with the protagonist is, a taste of his personality and his insight and his sensitivity and his vulnerability, as well as his courage. But I knew from the beginning we wanted to use these excerpts from the application. So we worked with Magdalena to just create kind of really what we hoped would be compelling little segments to kind of bring the application to life, or make you feel like you were in the application itself, part of this bureaucratic process, part of the authorship of one's own biography for a kind of political means, as well as integrating other archival elements and these reenactments in the present day.
It was really beautiful, really well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm curious to both hear about where that application process is at now, like how's he doing, what's going on? And then also I was thinking about this idea of two prisons. It's such a moving thing that he says in the film. And I'm thinking that it might be that, Americans might be able to relate to that in a fractional way, just being in a pandemic now and being in this lockdown situation. And I'm just curious if you think that, you know, that might help with Americans and empathy, or maybe not, you know, as, you know, we're seeing these authoritarian sort of regimes kind of on the rise. And what you might think about
I
that.
think it's you know, it's an unsettling time for everyone across the board. So, you know, a film like this, which is kind of unsettling, you know, to see this story recounted and to be left in the way that it leaves you. I don't know. I think people are willing to take in that kind of intense narrative, and to see someone managing that kind of experience courageously, hopefully provides some inspiration in and of itself. But to speak to what's happening now, luckily, Wang Zhangxia, this is the name of our protagonist, which I haven't mentioned yet, he was granted asylum, which is great, because otherwise he could be in very dire circumstances in China right now. So he's here in New York, and shortly after he was granted asylum, he enrolled in an EMT training program, and then went right on into a kind of paramedic training program. So he is currently on the front lines in New York, fighting the crisis. And yeah, it's amazing, you know.
I'm so
which ironically is also
wow.
Such a complex point of geopolitics between the U.S. and China. So he really just lives at the nexus of all of these crazy kind of geopolitical forces through his very personal experience.
Wow. Amazing. Thank you for that update. That's really wild. Thank you. Yeah. I'm curious. I don't know if any of the other filmmakers on this call, if you guys got a chance to watch each other's films. If you did, please feel free. Like if anybody else wants to ask. And if not, you should check it out. Anybody have any other questions before we move to another filmmaker? Okay.
Unfortunately, we didn't get the chance to watch everyone else's films. I would love to engage in that conversation.
Yeah, well, I'm so bummed too that we're not all together in person at a physical festival. That would be so much fun, because then we could have long conversations. But I'm happy that we have, you know, this to fill in the gaps. But well, let's go to Cecilia Brown with Root Shocked and talk about that film a little bit. I'm so curious about also, Cecilia, how you found that story and became involved with it, and then I'll go from there. Why don't you start with telling us about it a little bit?
Yeah, thanks. So I came across the story. I was in a master's program for multimedia journalism with the University of Oregon, and I was at their Portland campus, and I was about 4 months in, and we had been given an assignment to make our first documentary piece alone, which was incredibly intimidating. And I was looking for a story, and I was listening to OPB in the car one day, and I heard Cleo Davis, who is the protagonist of the film that I made, on OPB, doing an interview about a hearing that his family had been at the week prior. And the hearing was about his family trying to move a house that was set to be demolished down the street, 3 doors down, onto his grandmother's property, where there had been a vacant lot sitting there for the last 40 years. And the reason that it was vacant was because they live in the Elliott neighborhood, which is historically a Black neighborhood in Portland, and a series of property ordinances and city ordinances like redlining and blight had displaced thousands of Black families, particularly in the 70s and 80s, from this community. So as a result, his family had a 7-unit apartment building on this plot of land that had been demolished because of these property ordinances. And to sort of...
Can I ask you a question about that really quick?
Yeah.
Just because when I was watching the film, I was so fascinated and curious about the word blight, because blight has a couple of meanings. It can be a plant disease, or it can also just be something that's unsightly. And so I felt sort of like, what were they talking about? What do they mean? They blighted all of these homes, and then 70s and 80s. That's not that far back,
Yeah.
And so to me, the whole thing just sort of like reeked of systemic racism, and so the story becomes such an interesting story in terms of people being bold enough to like do their research and speak out. But I'm curious if you can speak to that. Like, what did you learn about this idea of blight?
Oh yeah, so much. I mean, first of all, like I had moved to Portland. I moved to Portland 3 years ago from New York City. I was living in Brooklyn, and like moving to Portland was a shock. People say all the time that it's the whitest city, but the truth is that it's just incredibly segregated. And I learned that sort of in doing this story. I learned a lot through doing this story because I just didn't know so much about Portland and Oregon's racist history, which really does persist. But blight is literally kicking people out of their homes for something as simple as like a blue step or a poorly painted home or like chipped paint. So it literally is demolishing a home for it being unsightly.
Okay, so it really was more about the unsightly version of the word. It wasn't like these places were infested with mold or something like this.
No, and it was really in the name of what they called urban renewal strategies, which ended up just displacing Black families. And it was sort of this like marketing twist that they put on it.
I see so much of that these days.
Yeah, exactly. So it was really interesting. And you were talking about like this family kind of doing their history, doing their research. And a big piece of the story is that Cleo and his wife, Keen, they're kind of artists and advocates in the Black community in Portland. And they had been spending all of this time in the city archives, learning about this history and learning the language, more importantly, so that they could go to this hearing and make a case for themselves. And, he taught himself sort of like all of the lingo of property ordinances and zoning changes, so that they could use that to their benefit to, like, in the hopes of moving this home so that they could turn it into a historical archive and an artist residency for the Black community. But to do that requires a lot of knowledge about zoning laws in order to make income off of this home so that they could regenerate some of the wealth that they had lost. I mean, they lost millions of dollars from having this home torn down. So, I mean, long story short, I heard this story on OPB and was really moved, and also saw it as not just a historical story, but something that was happening now. Like, I reached out to Cleo, and the house was possibly set to be moved a week later. So,
oh, wow.
There was a lot happening kind of in the works. And I just saw it as a really visual way to tell a history that I didn't know a lot about before coming into this. And so, like, I assumed a lot of people in the Portland area didn't know a lot about this history that was there.
Yeah. Well, I want to come back to all three of you with a last question, but before I do that, let's jump over to Luz Carasa with Giants, who's also a Portland filmmaker, and to hear about how, Luz, how you came to know about your story and how you jumped in there, because it seems like the footage in the film gets going again kind of early in the story. So how did you get tuned into that, and can you tell us about that?
Well, Giants is part of an anthology of short films called Canopy Stories. There are 12 shorts that portrays stories behind trees in Portland. So that was the beginning, like when Northwest Documentary, who produced this, asked me if I wanted to make a story about a tree. I knew that I wanted to tell something about a tree that was going to be cut down, because I wanted the audience to think a little bit about what's happening in Portland with like really fast development and what we're doing about the urban canopy. Mm-hmm. So that was like, okay, I need to find a tree that's going to be cut down, or it was cut down. And that's how I found Giants. And it was a great story because what you say, like it was covered by the media. So originally I thought like I was going to have a lot of access to a lot of footage. It was going to be easy to do. It turned out to be a little bit more difficult. That's why I ended up using animations and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But pretty much that's how everything started.
It, the giant trees of the Pacific Northwest, I think, are seen as such jewels of this region with the redwoods and the sequoias. So I just love that you made a film that way, and it was so inspiring to see that community activism. And I'm just curious about, did you learn anything that surprised you when you were getting to know the people that were involved?
It surprised me how little we know about regulations in our own city and regulations about our own trees. Like these neighbors, they didn't know anything. And the majority of people, we see how they cut trees down. We don't know what to do about that. We don't even know if it's legal or it's not legal or where we should call or anything. So that was surprising. It was not surprising, but gratifying to see how all the people get together and try to support and try to help as they can. That was a good experience, yeah.
It was a really fun little twist to see that all of a sudden the South Park guys were involved.
I know, and really that's the reason why they were able to save those trees, right? Because they had good connections. These are upper middle class neighbors, so they have money, they have connections. That's the sad part of it. Like the majority of neighborhoods don't have those connections, and they're not really able to save the trees.
I think something that I'm hearing from you Portland filmmakers and these stories with Root Shocked and Giants is just like the importance of educating ourselves in our communities and trying to learn how to use those tools to our advantage. But I think what I'd love to hear from all three of you, and anybody just pipe up at any time, whoever feels like speaking first, but I'm always so curious to hear filmmakers talk about how did you gain the trust of the people that you were filming so that they felt comfortable with you and comfortable telling their story with you?
Well, I'm now that map. For me, I met with them several times and we talk about a lot of things. So I think like they were comfortable seeing what my perspective was in all this. Like I really wanted to make it objective, and I tried to have City of Portland participating, and even the developer, that didn't happen. They didn't want to participate, but I think they felt that I wanted to tell the story right, and to tell what they were really doing, what they did. So yeah, it wasn't very hard though.
Oh, good. Thank you. How about you, Casey?
I agree. It wasn't very hard, luckily, because there was just a nice rapport. I mean, Zhangxia, the protagonist of the film, he and I are very good friends now. We weren't necessarily when the film began, but there was immediately many points of interest in our conversations. And I think the first night I met with him in New York, and his first couple of weeks here, we were hanging out with a few mutual friends, and we were at a bar or something, and it was all a bunch of small talk. And for whatever reason, I began to ask him about his experience, and I don't know, maybe he was. I was surprised the extent to which he spoke to me openly in that context about the kind of traumas that he had experienced. And maybe it was just my blunt kind of curiosity about it that led him to speak to me so kind of honestly. And then we met for dinner like a week later, and he really told me everything. And then from there on out, I had the total story of everything that's portrayed in the film. And so I came back to him I don't know, a week or a couple of weeks later, kind of with the idea for how I wanted to make the film, to visit spaces in the city that have some sort of correspondence to these places in Beijing, and to kind of engage in a storytelling / reenactment mode in these different spaces, and to use the excerpts from his asylum application, which he had already authored. And I kind of just laid it out, and he was like, yeah, that sounds like a very interesting idea. Let's do it. So then we made it over the next 5 or 6 months.
Oh, that's great. And then how about you, Cecilia?
Gaining trust was a little bit more challenging, I think, for me than for you guys. It was Cleo being the main character. He was rightfully really nervous about having his story documented, and I think that, and we've talked about this, comes from, kind of being screwed over by journalists in the past, and that happening to many people in the Black community. So it took some time to gain trust, and one of the ways that I did that was through making the experience really collaborative, and that was easy for me because I hadn't really made a piece before on my own, and I didn't really have any preconceived notions of what making a documentary was supposed to be like. Mm-hmm. So I involved Cleo a lot in the process of deciding who to interview and who was going to tell which pieces of the story. I showed him drafts and incorporated his feedback. So the whole process ended up being really collaborative. And now we're still really close, and he's got all these other ideas that he wants to work together on in the future. It's come a long way, but it was a really, really enjoyable process, and it sort of informed for me the process that I want to go through in making documentaries in the future. I really enjoy the collaborative nature of this piece.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. I don't know if anybody else wants to speak about maybe what you have coming up next. And if you would like to share anything like that with us in terms of what you're working on creatively next. And then I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. But thank you.
Maybe I have one more thought.
Okay.
Just in with the issue of gaining trust, because I was thinking about these scenes in the film. Some of them are very, very intense, and it doesn't sound like someone just casually telling a friend a story, which is sort of how I came to know the story. So I think there is another layer of not just trust, but something that came out of the process of working on the film in a particular way, which is this immersion in an environment that leads to an immersion in a certain psychological space. So for example, the final scene in the film, in which Zhangxia is in a space that is meant to represent a windowless, clockless black jail space where he was held for several weeks in Beijing. We found a kind of shoddy hotel room in Queens and rented it out for the night, and just set up in there, and basically for several hours on end just had conversations about what it was like to be in that space in Beijing. And it's most of the time, what he experienced and his resilience is totally sufficient to feel completely comfortable speaking about it to someone else. That's a responsibility that he feels to speak about his experience. But when you're really kind of immersed in this context, it definitely can get very emotional. And
that's a really interesting idea that you worked with, is just sort of playing with or utilizing the environment to bring back those feelings. Yeah.
Right. So that's definitely another element to what created what might be seen as just a sense of trust. It is a sense of trust, but it's also the effect of the process that draws that out.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Well, I'm just really honored to have this conversation with all of you, and impressed with your bravery for telling these stories. And I think it's important, it's important to talk about how we engage with our communities and engage with the structural elements and the rules. And, sometimes it's very harmonious, and sometimes we feel the need to rebel so that we can have a seat at the table or whatever. But appreciate that you guys all told these stories. So thank you so much. Thanks for being a part of our festival. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
This was great.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, you guys. I hope we get to meet in person one of these days, maybe next year. And please, I hope everybody's staying safe and sound and healthy. And wow, thank you for that too. I'm sure everybody's making efforts on that front.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.